Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Helping Students Understand How to Pay for College. This is part 2 in FCAN's How to Pay for College webinar series. I am your host, Kathy McDonald, Assistant Director for Network Partnerships with the Florida College Access Network. FCAN would like to thank our cornerstone funder, Helios Education Foundation, and supporters Wells Fargo and the National College Attainment Network for their generous support of our College Ready Florida initiatives and this webinar series. I am so thrilled to welcome on our call today guest presenter Daniel Barkowitz, who's the Assistant Vice President for Financial Aid and Veterans Affairs at Valencia College. Anytime we want to talk financial aid or how to pay for college, he's my go-to expert. So we're excited to have him with us today. Now, before we get started, a few housekeeping items. First, we welcome your questions. So please submit those in the question box, which you should see in your dashboard on the right side of your computer if you're viewing from your desktop. We're going to allot time at the end for questions, but put those in anytime. If there's something that really connects to a slide he's got up on the screen, we'll try and jump in and get your questions answered right away. We want to make sure this is a good hour for you. Second, please share what you're learning on social media. We love to learn what's resonating with you. And finally, all the material, this webinar is being recorded. All the materials will be available to you within a week of the recording. You should see some handouts in your dashboard. If you don't worry about it. We will send those to you after the webinar as well. Now, for those of you who are new to FCAN and aren't as familiar with our work, our mission is to lead the collaborative movement to ensure every Floridian achieves an education beyond high school and a rewarding career. Our vision, there it goes, is to build a Florida working together where education is the pathway to economic mobility for all. We accomplish our work in 3 primary ways. First is through the local college access network, which supports 82% of the state's population. These are networks that are comprised of community leaders who come together to create solutions in partnership to support their local talent development. Second, FCAN publishes research and data on evidence-based practices and policy opportunities to strengthen Florida's talent pool. And finally, FCAN coordinates 4 College Ready Florida initiatives that provide schools and community organizations the resources they need to help students continue their education after high school, which is part of what we're going to talk about today. Now, guiding our work is our 7 conditions for success, which you can learn more about on our website. Today's webinar provides a great example of many of these conditions, particularly opportunity for everyone, clear information and guidance, and affordability. And with that, it is my sincere pleasure to help get us started today to introduce and welcome Brawlio Colon, who's our Vice President of the Florida Student Success Initiatives with the Helios Education Foundation. Brawlio, it's such a pleasure to have you with us today. Welcome.
Thank you, Kathy, and good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to join FCAN in welcoming each of you to today's webinar focused on the important topic of paying for college. As Kathy mentioned, my name is Brawlio Colon, and I have the privilege of serving as Vice President for Florida Student Success Initiatives at Helios Education Foundation, where I help lead the implementation of Helios's community investment strategy for college access and success. Our mission at Helios is to create opportunities for individuals to succeed in post-secondary education in Florida and Arizona. We invest across the entire education continuum from early learning, K-12, through post-secondary. And so I encourage each of you to visit our website at helios.org to learn more about our strategy and our collaborative work. Like you, Helios believes in the transformational power of education and how that power can change individuals' lives and communities. That's why we partner with organizations like FCAN, who are deeply committed to bringing resources to communities to help empower and deepen collaboration to improve student outcomes. We at Helios also believe that it's only through partnership that we can achieve our mission. It takes all of us working together to eliminate achievement gaps, to bring the opportunity of college to marginalized communities, and to bring the information and resources necessary to support students all along the way. So today I want to encourage each of you, particularly our counselors and advisors participating today. You know, we have all lived and worked through an extremely difficult time over the last year. The COVID reality has changed all of us, and it has impacted every area of our lives. And our careers and our work are no exception. But I know the courage I have seen, and I know the courage that has been demonstrated by our educators, including our guidance counselors and student advisors. And it's nothing short of extraordinary and inspiring. Never before has the student need for guidance, advice, counseling been so great. And for students who unfortunately are having to navigate the college going process in this environment, they are at an unprecedented disadvantage. What I also know is that because of COVID and the strain it's placed on our schools, our counselors are being asked to take on additional responsibilities related to safety and so many other areas. But the fact that you're on this webinar today says a lot about your commitment to students. And we all know that college enrollment immediately after high school graduation is so important for ensuring success for our students, not only in college, but in life after college. So I want to also recognize and thank our parents who are participating on today's webinar as well. Your advocacy for students in our schools is extremely important, and we thank you for that. Whether it's your engagement is through PTA or independently, just know how much Helios and our educators appreciate your service and work with our schools and students. So thank you for participating today as well. Now, I must say today with Dr. Barkowitz, you have the best of the best delivering some powerful data and insights that we hope will inform the important work we have ahead of us. So on behalf of Helios Education Foundation, thank you, and thanks to FCAN for bringing us all together.
Thanks, Brawlio. Really appreciate it. And I appreciate your recognition of what a challenging year it's been, but we're excited to have everyone because we believe we can still finish strong. So with that, let's get started. As many of you know, some of you attended the webinar on scholarships a couple of weeks ago. Our students and families are still struggling with figuring out how to pay for college, and it can be confusing and stressful. So I know some of you are calling in from other states. We're going to be focusing on Florida today, but I think the principles of what we're sharing will still be relevant in your local community. Now, a quick reminder from last time, we learned from one of our friends and partners, CareerSource Suncoast, that when they surveyed 800 students from 7 Florida counties last year, there's still a lot of confusion with students in understanding how they go about paying for college. 21% of those students hadn't even started thinking about it, where nearly 60% of them plan to use scholarships, despite the fact that 52% of Florida students are Pell Grant eligible, and 4 out of 5 of them receive some combination of federal, state, and school-based aid to pay for college. So to access the bulk of that aid, they need to complete a FAFSA, which is why we have the FAFSA challenge. And yet, at least according to this survey, only 2% of students planned to use Pell Grant to attend college. So it got us curious as to why that's the case. And in the same survey, one of the things that we learned is 35% of the students said they didn't even know what the FAFSA was. So for all of you who are working so hard to try and get the message out with our students, many of them are still confused. And another 27% said they were just overwhelmed by the whole college going process, which is why your work and your support is so important and so critical. So we've been working hard to create this one-page tool that hopefully can help reduce some of the confusion, and we encourage you to use it. It's really helpful to paint the picture for students and families that there's 3 main sources of funding for college. The first is their family funds. So that includes savings, college savings plans, gifts, earnings from work, and things like private loans. The second is where in many cases the bulk of the support comes from, and that's through financial aid, which can come from federal, state, and school-based sources. And the third, which we talked a little bit about on the last webinar, is gap funding. So this is often scholarships from outside sources beyond the school at both the local and the regional or national level. It can also include things like employer tuition reimbursement programs. So again, just a quick reminder, you should see this handout in your dashboard. If you don't, we'll email it out or let us know if you didn't get it. I saw in the question box somebody didn't get the last one, so we'll make sure we get those out to you. For those of you who are working with adult learners, I know Daniel will touch on this a little bit later. Obviously, we always encourage people to start with the FAFSA, but they should look at, kind of the perimeter of this chart. So are they a vet? Do they have access to the GI Bill? Things like WIOA funds, EASE, are, again, employer tuition reimbursement programs are all sources for our adult learners to return and finish that credential. Now, it's a lot. There's a lot of different sources out there, and not every source is created equal, which is why I'm so thrilled to welcome Daniel on today's webinar to really help us understand if students aren't going to do everything, what are the most important things for them to do in order to prepare for and pay for college. So with that, Daniel, I'm so excited to have you here. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you to FCAN for offering this opportunity. I'm thrilled to be with you and to spend some time with you talking about the various sources of funds and providing some information. Just to give you a little bit of background about myself, I've been working in financial aid over 30 years at a number of different institutions, some like Valencia, a public open access institution. And I've also worked at more closed, sort of limited access institutions, including in Massachusetts and other states, New York. So I'm thrilled actually to talk and to give you a really broad view and overview of what funds are available and how to access them. We're going to start though with what forms do families need to know. And I often, when I do this presentation for students or for families, I often pick a student to participate with me, and I'll say, okay, so name the colleges you're considering applying to. And at the risk of leaving one out, let's do that activity now. So let's say I've picked a student whose name happens to be Brawlio. I don't know, maybe, that name just came to me out of nowhere, but let's say Brawlio decides that he's applying to 5 schools. And those 5 schools are, for lack of a better set of schools, we'll start with Harvard. We'll add to that list Stetson, we'll add to that list FSU and University of Florida because, you would be in both applicant pools. And at the final point, we'll add Valencia. So we've got 5 colleges from Harvard to Valencia, the whole educational gamut. What I'll often ask families is how many applications, if Brawlio and his family want to apply for all of the money they could be eligible for, how many financial aid applications does Brawlio need to complete? And what I'll often hear back, and maybe we'll try this out if you want to type your answer in the Q&A box, why don't you let us know out of the 5 schools, how many applications in total does Brawlio need to complete to make sure he and his family have access to all of the different financial aid funds that are out there? And I bet probably some of you are thinking 1, some of you might be guessing 2, some of you might be guessing 5. We're going to talk about the answer, and it's actually 8, so or up to 8. And it's important to understand that, and as you counsel students, to help them understand what those applications are. So let's go through them. So the first form is the Fafsa, and Fafsa stands for Free Application for Federal Student Aid. It is an annual application required from every student applying for college. So that includes siblings who will do 1 form for each. If a student and a parent are going to school, both the student and the parent will complete the form. It's also needed for graduate school or for adult learners. So it's the same form. Everyone completes a Fafsa, and they list all of the colleges they're applying to on that form. You probably know lots about Fafsa. The applications do open October 1 of a student's senior year in high school. for the following year. What we know is that students who apply early get more funding. So the earlier you get your application done, the better. That's not to say you can't do it later, but you still want to try to do it as soon as possible if you're a parent or student. In addition, what we know this year, which is both a little disappointing, but probably also not too surprising, is that there has been a significant reduction in the number of families completing the FAFSA this year. In part, we think because of what's going on with the pandemic. In part, we think because there's just been ongoing confusion and I have deep respect for our high school guidance colleagues and the work they do with their students in school. It's difficult enough to provide counseling and guidance remotely, and to try to do FAFSA completion guidance remotely is even more difficult. So what we do know is that the numbers are down in terms of FAFSA filers. So everything we can do to encourage FAFSA filers, the better. So that is the FAFSA. The FAFSA is the single start, but not the end of the application cycle. So let's go to the second application. The next application that students should be aware of is the Css Financial Aid Profile. Now, many families overlook this application. This is an application that is primarily required for colleges that have significant amount of their own resource to provide for families. It's mainly required of private, not-for-profit colleges. So if a student's only applying to our state or flagship state institutions, they won't need to complete a profile. But if students applying to, we use Stetson and Harvard, like Brawlio is, both of them require the CSS profile. So in that situation, for Brawlio to get access to the financial aid, the grants and scholarships that Harvard or Stetson would offer, it's really important for him and his family to complete that CSS financial aid profile as well. It is an annual application as well, and it is a paid application, unlike the FAFSA, although there are fee waivers available for students who qualify, but there is a fee to apply. And I've given you a link in terms of information on where you can find out more about the CSS profile. So we've talked about the FAFSA, we've talked about the CSS profile. There's a third type of application we're going to talk about next. That is the institutional application. So every school may, this is not a definite, but every school may have its own application for its own scholarship programs. I'll talk for a minute about the college I work at, Valencia. We have several $1 million a year that we provide in foundation support through donor advised or donor matched scholarship programs. And in those situations, if the student does not apply for consideration under the scholarship program, then we won't consider the student for that scholarship. So it is important that students ask, is there a specific scholarship application, or do the research on the web for your institution, and how do I apply for that? So at Valencia, we have a scholarship application that is open to every incoming student. We encourage them to complete that annually, and we use it as part of our scholarship matching process to help to provide additional support to students who need it. Sometimes that's need-based, sometimes that's not need-based. Sometimes that's restricted to only US citizens or permanent residents, sometimes not. Speaking of which, looking at those first three, if I were advising an undocumented student or a student who doesn't hold permanent residence or citizenship in the US, the FAFSA won't work, but the other forms will. So that undocumented student could fill out the CSS profile and may receive financial aid in the form of institutional grant funds from an institution that does provide that support to students. So important to know that as well. So for Brawlio, we have one FAFSA, one CSS profile, and potentially up to 5 additional institutional applications. So that brings us to 7. We're not quite done. There's one final application we don't want to forget, and this is specific for the state of Florida. In the state of Florida, there is the Florida Financial Aid application. And again, if you're one of my colleagues in the guidance office at high schools, you know about this form, and you help students do this every year, but it is required once per student career in their senior year of high school. And it's critical. We often refer to this as the Bright Futures application. it's not simply for Bright Futures families or students. Every high school senior should complete this form because this form is important for lots of different Florida State scholarship programs and grant programs. We're going to talk about those grant and scholarship programs a little later in the presentation, but it's really important that students don't forget this application. It's a very simple application, but you cannot do it after you graduate. You have to complete this application during that senior year of high school, even if you're going out of state, even if you don't think you're going to qualify for Bright Futures, every student will need to complete this. Now, before we go to the next slide, I want to point out one more feature on this slide. You'll see at the bottom of the page a little icon, computer icon, that says Learn More. So I realize there are lots of questions about financial aid, and chances are we won't be able to address all of them today. So I actually have a blog that I keep on financial aid topics. It's at moneymanblog.com. And I'm going to be highlighting some pointers for you when we talk about topics today, and I'll give you a list of reference points where you can do some more research and learn some more about the application process. There's lots of great information out there on the blog. You can feel free to share that with families and students. And it's written generically. So again, you won't find my name or identity anywhere on the blog. It's not meant to be a Valencia College piece. It's really meant to be just basic information about how the financial aid system does work. So let's go look at the next slide.
Daniel, I just wanted to jump in.
Sure.
Our dear friend Pedro Hernandez with the state is clarifying that the Florida financial aid applications deadline is August 31st. So they have a little bit of time after they graduate, but not much. So
I'm glad we have Pedro on the line to keep me honest.
Yeah.
He does that all the time. So Pedro, thank you for that. But yes, that is correct. Actually, technically, it's through August 31st of the student senior year in high school. And if I say anything else wrong, please call me on it. Pedro, I'd appreciate that as well. So let's look at the nationwide perspective. So I'm going to share with you some information I find really helpful as I talk with families about what money is there and what's available. And this pie chart is something I put together from data available from the College Board. The College Board every year does a series of reports called the Trends Reports. If you aren't looking at these, you should be. There's one called Trends in College Pricing and one called Trends in Student Aid. And these data that I'm going to share with you right now come from the Trends in Student Aid report. And this is the one that was just published in 2020, estimating the numbers, the final numbers for the 1920 academic year. What you'll see on the pie chart is this is the makeup of all the funds that are available nationwide for undergraduate students. I've focused here on undergraduate. I will say graduate is a whole different conversation. The data is or are available in the Trends report. So if you're curious about graduate education, go to the website, trends.collegeboard.org. You can download the same kind of data specifically focused on graduate education. I'm focusing here on undergraduate, but those data are available. What you'll notice is this is broken up into both source or type of funds and source of funds in the pie chart. And I want to draw your attention to what's the largest slice of that pie. Right? We often think, or families often think, that the single largest source of funding is federal grant money or federal loans, and they would be incorrect. So if you look at the single largest source of funding, it's actually institutional grants that represent the single largest slice of pie in this pie chart. The reason that's important is because you want to make sure as a family that you do everything possible to apply for institutional grants. If that means filling out a profile, filling out a profile. If that means filling out the scholarship application at the college, filling out the scholarship application. That's not to minimize the other sources at all. They're important, but again, institutional grants are a very large section. The other piece that's important is, and again, we'll start by looking at the type of funding. So often there's a misconception that loans are the main source of financial aid for our families. The reality is, again, based on the College Board's data, that grants, scholarships, and VA benefits represent almost 2/3 of the funding that's available nationwide for undergraduates. Loans represent about 1/3. That's a fairly large proportion, but I will tell you that over time, that number has actually come down. About 15 or 20 years ago, that number was half of the money available nationwide in the form of financial aid was loans. So that number has been decreasing over time. Work, like federal work study, you'll see represented as 0%. It is less than 1%. There is work study money available, but it doesn't raise to the point of actually covering 1%, which is why it's reported as 0. And finally, tax benefits. We don't often think about tax benefits as a financial aid source, but it's important in counseling families that they understand that there could be tax benefits for the purpose of paying tuition, where they can deduct some of that tuition paid from their income earned to reduce their tax burden in the years that they are in fact paying for education. If we look then at the source, if we do another little slice here and figure out the source of funding, also important to keep in mind, as we see here, right? Federal aid is about half of the money, state aid is about 6%, institutional aid about 28%, and private aid, private sources, meaning outside of the federal government, about 14%. You can see, I know you spent a lot of time in our last conversation on scholarships from outside agencies or gap funding. Gap funding is about 7% of the total cost a student will receive. Now, that's not to say it's minimal in importance, it's critical in importance, but it is not as, as valuable dollar for dollar or as widespread dollar for dollar as some of these other sources. So really important to understand and to help families understand where the source of their funding is coming from and the type of funding. And again, finally, there's a link here to a deeper dive into these data if you'd like to look a little closer at these data as well. Kathy, anything before we move to the next slide? I'm guessing no, since we moved. Okay, so let's talk about undergraduate financial aid on average. So the last slide we talked about nationally. What I wanted to do was do a very deep dive into the individual student level. So if I'm a student in college, what am I experiencing on the individual level? Now, here's the challenge with that. What we know is that costs and aid vary widely sector by sector. If I'm going to a high-cost private not-for-profit institution, I'm going to have a very different financial aid package than I will at a low-cost public open access institution. We also know if I'm full-time versus part-time, it's going to look different. But I wanted to give you an average across all enrolled students. Again, including people who don't get any money, but what's the average financial aid that students are receiving? And within each category, you can see it's combined by source. So I did not break out federal from state, from institutional, from private. But on average, across the entire country, total aid per enrolled student is just shy of $16,000. So again, this is an important message for students to understand. There is a lot of money that's being given out on average per student. And if you compare that to the average national total cost, you can see the national total cost chart there listed as well. And that's, again, national averages. And that's not just tuition and fees. That's tuition fees, room and board, books, transportation, miscellaneous expenses, etc. You can see that, that financial aid package on average is going to help significantly each individual family. But we're going to dive a little deeper and try to get into the individual sector question in a moment. But before we do that, let me just check in. Kathy, any questions that we should address before we move on?
No, I think we're good. I think the next one's going to be really important for everyone to see.
So let's move then to the next slide. And again, I'm hopeful this information is helpful for you. I think it is. And again, it helps sort of contextualize the entire piece. This is now institutional grant by sector. So remember I said 28% of all the money that's out there is in the form of institutional grant. How does that differ by sector? How does that differ between public 4-year, private 4-year not-for-profit, public 2-year, and for-profit schools? And these data that you're seeing right now, I think are really helpful to begin to understand. And just to be clear, these are only grants from the institution. This does not include federal grants. This does not include state grants. This is only grants at the institution. Again, these are national numbers. This is not Florida specific. These are national numbers. What you'll see on each line, each of these lines of this bar graph, the total line represents the whole cost of tuition and fees for that school. So on average, so for public school years, if you add the 7,700 and the 5,700, you get 13,400. In 2015-16, the average cost for public four-year institutions nationwide was about $13,400. On average, a student attending a public four-year school was receiving $5,700 in institutional grant, meaning their out-of-pocket cost, that was the black number, was the $5,700. Their out-of-pocket cost was the blue number, or $7,700. So on average, those students were paying $7,700, each one of them. Now, again, what's important to know here is look at the number at the next line down, private, not-for-profit 4 years. You can see on average that scholarship is $19,100, almost 4 times as much as the scholarship at a public four-year institution. So if I'm a student and just simply comparing scholarships, I might say, well, at my private four-year institution, I got a scholarship that's 4 times as valuable as the one I got at my public four-year institution, so therefore it must be better. But the reality is we really have to focus on that remaining cost, that blue line. Look on average, again, you'll see that at private not-for-profit colleges, the out-of-pocket cost is still almost double what you'll pay on average at a public four-year institution. So again, this doesn't count loans and work and other ways of paying for it, but it's important to understand what the impact of that institutional grant is in terms of what we call net cost. Here's my advice. I know we in the high schools love to tout and to talk about how much scholarship money our schools have gotten. I've worked with high schools that publish the number. Our students have received over $3 million in scholarship offers. I think that rewards the wrong number, right? Because the scholarship offer is all well and good. However, that isn't a true reflection of what the net cost is. The net cost is the more important number, because millions of dollars of scholarship may still leave you with millions of dollars of out-of-pocket cost. So again, I think this chart helps to hit home that it's really that net cost number that's the most important thing we should be looking at. So as we move forward, I want to now dive into our Florida situation. And so for those of you from out of state, we're going to do a deep dive into Florida financial aid. And again, Pedro will keep me honest, but this is a pie chart that shows you the dollar percentages of all of our Florida financial aid programs. If you're like me, if you haven't done a deep dive into this, you may not even know that we have all these Florida financial aid programs. You may have thought that the only Florida financial aid program was Bright Futures. And what I'm here to tell you today is that we have a host of Florida financial aid programs that are available statewide, and you can see all of them on this chart. These numbers come from the Florida Office of Student Financial Assistance end-of-year reports, which are a publicly available resource. You can log in and view them yourself. What I did is just simply take each of the end-of-the-year reports for each of the programs and added the numbers up. And also, you'll see in a moment, divided by sector. So we'll look at sector when we go to the next slide, but we won't move there yet. We'll spend a little more time on this slide first. So what you'll see is that in 2019-20, total financial aid from the state of Florida given to students and families was slightly over $1 billion. That's billion with a B. Now note, that does not include state subsidy of higher education. So I know a number of two-year institutions and four-year institutions get a direct subsidy from the budget of the state. I'm not including that number here. I'm talking about just money that goes directly to students and families. through the Florida Office of Student Financial Aid scholarship and work programs. You'll also notice, and these numbers again come from Florida themselves in terms of how the state categorizes these programs, you'll notice that about 26% of the money is need-based, about 61% is merit-based, and the remainder is what's categorized as tuition assistance. Now, let's take a deeper look at that pie chart. What's the largest program out there? Oh, sorry, go back there. Thank you. The largest program out there is that 59%, and that is the Florida Bright Future Scholarship Program. I know many of you are familiar with this program. It's paid for using lottery proceeds. It is really designed to help support and reward students with academic promise, students who have succeeded in high school, who've demonstrated that success through academic programs and success in GPA, through SAT or ACT scores, through completion of a set number of courses, and through commitment to community service. So it's a wonderful program. It has various flavors. There is the top students who are called Florida Academic Scholars. There's Florida Medallion. There's several vocational programs built in. But by and large, it does not base itself on need. It is a merit-based program unapologetically. So regardless of what your family's income is, you can qualify for full tuition coverage, tuition and fees at our public institutions if you succeed academically and you again complete that Florida financial aid application. So that is the Bright Futures program. That's the single largest program. I want to talk about the rest of them, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them, but again, this may be the first time you're hearing some of these names. And so I'm going to go through and just give a quick description about each of these programs. So the Florida Farm Worker Student Scholarship Program, which is only about $100,000 in 1920, that's a relatively new program. It's a need-based financial aid, need and merit-based program. It has a maximum of 50 students, and it's only at public colleges. It covers tuition and fees for up to 50 students who are selected every year. They have to be farm workers or children of farm workers. The next really big portion of this pie chart is the Florida Student Assistance Grant. You'll see that's 26%. This is the largest need-based program, and you might argue really the only purely need-based program that's available. And it serves as a block grant. Basically, institutions are given a set of money that they then spend on students using parameters and policies they establish with some limitations. We're required to give it to the most needy Florida residents. Again, Florida residency is important. So again, total given out in the year was over $269 million. But you can see as a percentage, it's 26% of the total given out. Really quickly, let's go through some of these smaller programs. I won't spend a lot of time on them, but I want to at least give you the description. The Florida Work Experience Program, it's basically like work study, except it's the source of funding is the state of Florida. It's available at colleges if they participate. The Honorably Discharged Graduate Assistance Program, probably not really well named because you don't have to be a graduate student to receive it. It's for veterans to help get them support in periods of non-enrollment during breaks. So breaks between terms or breaks in a term. That's the point of that program. The Jose Marti Scholarship Challenge Grant to help students of Hispanic origin who attend Florida public or private institutions. You'll see Minority Teacher Education Scholar Program, self-explanatory, but really for programs that offer teacher education for students who are African American, Hispanic American, Asian American, Native American. Rosewood is for survivors of the Rosewood incident in 1923. Descendants of survivors of that massacre can qualify for tuition, full-time tuition. The Bethune Scholarship Program is limited to a couple of colleges in the state of Florida: Bethune-Cookman, Edward Waters, Florida A&M, or Florida Memorial. You'll see scholarships for children and spouses of deceased or disabled veterans. The Benequisto is what used to be called the National Merit Scholarship Program. That's the one program that's available even if you're an out-of-state recipient. If you're a National Merit finalist, it helps pay the total cost of attendance at a Florida college. ABLE and EASE are programs that are really designed for private colleges and universities to help offset their costs. And then finally, you'll see the first generation matching program, where the state puts up basically 67 cents on the dollar, and colleges have to match it from a donor. And then together, that amount is offered to students who are the first in their family to attend college. So that's a very quick description. If you want much more information, the Florida Office of Student Financial Aid webpage has tons of information on each of these programs. And Pedro will keep me honest if I said anything objectionable during that, but that's a quick thumbnail description of each of those programs. By and large, they don't have as much of a reach, as you can tell, in comparison to the Florida Student Assistance Program and then the real biggest program, which is that Florida Bright Futures program. As our final or next to final slide, and we'll move on to the next slide now, what I wanted to do then was say, okay, we looked at these by program. How does it look by sector? So if I took the dollars that were given out in 2019-20 and I broke it up into individual sector, what's the percentage of money that's being spent in each individual sector? And what you'll see on this slide is that our public four-year institutions, our flagship institutions in the state of Florida publicly, are getting the lion's share of the funding from these programs. And that makes sense, right? So by and large, 66% of the funding statewide in student financial assistance is going to those four-year public colleges. The reason that makes sense logically is because of the Bright Futures program. Bright Futures program pays full tuition, and by impact, students who are qualifying for Bright Futures tend to get admitted to and attend those public four-year institutions. You'll see public two-year institutions, and I included all the state colleges in that, so Valencia, Tallahassee Community College, Hillsborough Community, St. Petersburg College, etc. Public two-year institutions receive about 14% of the funding from these programs. Private for-profit, about 1%, private non-for-profit, about 19%, and our public vocational schools, again, a trace, not measurable as a percent, but something less than 1%. What I think is important to understand, especially if you're helping to advise students, is if you compare that breakdown to the actual breakdown of enrollment in Florida colleges all throughout our Florida educational system or educational ecosystem, what you'll see is that the largest enrollment is actually at the public two-year institutions. We have, in those institutions, 47% of the enrollment, yet they're receiving, students who attend those institutions, basically 14% of the funding. So you can sort of see who are the, not that they're winners and losers here, but you can see where there's overrepresentation of funding versus underrepresentation. I would counter that by also saying the costs are different, obviously. So at a public four-year institution, you're paying more on average than you would at a public two-year institution. So the aid does make sense to some level that it's different. And remember, this is only student-focused funding. This does not include state subsidies. But it is instructive to look at these numbers as we think about, from a student advising perspective, how state funding may impact their ability to pay for college as they move forward. So with that, let's move to our last slide that I've got. And I wanted to just give you some more references after today. So let's say you've got more you want to research, you want to learn more. Notice, by the way, a couple of points. We didn't talk today about coronavirus-specific financial aid. We will cover that in one of the later sessions in this series. We also did not talk specifically about what to do if you as a family or the students you advise have been impacted by interruptions, either interruptions in employment or in income. We'll also spend lots of time talking about that. But if you wanted to get a head start, I did give you some reference points here. So my blog address is here, and I've highlighted a couple of important pieces. We talk a lot about verification and the stumbling block that verification can be. So I have a whole category on the blog about verification. That link is here. There was a question that was submitted in advance about how do we determine what you're eligible for? If I'm a disabled parent, or there's assets in my student name, or I've lost a job, what happens? How do we determine your eligibility? So I've linked to a category of posts that dive very deep into how we determine your family contribution if you want to read more there. There's a piece on scholarships specifically, and there's a piece on applying for aid generically. And then I've got information that is coronavirus related. One of them is the Higher Education Emergency Relief Fund, which is posted as a category. And then information about special circumstances and professional judgment is also posted here as a category if you want to do research or read more in preparation for our later conversations. Again, we will be doing a more deep dive into some of these conversations a little later in our presentation cycle. But we wanted to give you a heads up that this information is out there now. There's one final piece I just want to mention, Kathy, before we jump into questions. And that, in case you thought your education was over after this workshop series, it never ends when it comes to financial aid. The Coronavirus Response Act and the Omnibus Spending Bill, which was an 8,000-page piece of legislation that was signed into law on December 27th, included major changes to our financial aid system, including major changes to the Fafsa. I know that FCAN has shared some good information about that. Those changes don't go into effect until the 23-24 academic year. So I am assuring you that there will be lots of training coming about those changes, but just be aware that there will be significant changes coming down the line about how the FAFSA works, and there'll be some eligibility changes as well. So this is my plug to stay active, stay involved, and stay talking to us, because it's important that you get the most up-to-date information.
Great, thank you, Daniel. Always so helpful. And in teeing up some of our future topics, verification is another one of those areas we're going to be bringing some folks back to talk about. Can you, one of the questions I get asked about more than just about any other is undocumented students or students with unique immigration status. So can you talk a little bit about what is available to them?
Thanks for that question, Kathy. I think first of all, it's important to understand what we mean, especially in this sort of supercharged environment around students who are not US citizens. We need to begin by understanding the distinction that the federal government makes between what they refer to as eligible non-citizens and ineligible non-citizens. So let's start there before we go any farther, right? The first piece is that you don't have to be a citizen to get federal aid. You do have to have permanent resident or some other eligible status, but it's important that in our messaging, we differentiate between students who are still eligible for federal aid and those who are not. So DACA undocumented students are not eligible for federal aid, but students who have a green card or students who came here on refugee status may in fact be eligible. So just the precision of language is really important around this topic. And I know you know that. I'm just saying for the benefit of all of us, we often find that the messaging gets muddied. And in fact, students who could qualify don't apply because they think they won't. So that's one piece. Secondly, let's talk about specifically undocumented students and students who are in the DACA program. It is true that they do not qualify for federal aid. However, there are lots of other aid programs they would qualify for. Remember on our chart, we said that federal aid is about half of the money that's available, only about half. So that means there are still lots of programs available, including state grant, potentially, institutional grant, definitely, private foundation grant, absolutely. So again, I would encourage students to think about in that category, maybe not the FAFSA, although definitely looking at all of the other application materials that are available, including CSS Profile, including college and university foundation scholarships or private scholarship applications, and again, our friends in the community foundations and other organizations that provide scholarship funding. Students can still qualify for all of those types of funding, depending upon the individual funding source.
Yes, thank you for clarifying that. Okay, I'm hearing, what can a student that will attend an out-of-state college receive funding from Bright Futures to attend a state college during the summer as they finish up their AA before transferring out?
So generally not, because you need to be matriculated and enrolled as a full-time degree-seeking student at that institution. So Bright Futures does not allow sort of transient status unless you're enrolled in another Florida institution. You can then go transient back and forth. So for example, if I'm a UCF student and I tell Bright Futures I'm a UCF student, I can take classes at Valencia as a transient student and be funded. But I can't do that if I'm at Georgia State. So I know with a lot of our students, they think I'm leaving Florida, I'm never coming back. I don't have to do that Florida financial aid application. I would still advise them to do it anyway because plans change and you cannot go backwards in time. Regardless of what Michael J. Fox tells you in Back to the Future, you cannot go backwards in time. So really important that you get that application done when you can do it, even if you think you're leaving and not coming back to Florida.
Okay, great. Would you please explain what IDOC is and what it's used for? A student asked them about it and a college requested it.
Yeah, thank you. So Idoc is not the doctor you go to get your prescription lenses. It is actually a service that is offered by the College Board. To do this, let me talk a little bit about verification. So as you know, if you're selected for verification, you often have to provide information directly to the college to prove what you've answered on the Fafsa or the CSS profile. The challenge is that you have to send that documentation to each and every college individually. So if you apply to 5 colleges, you're selected for verification, you have to send it to all 5 of them. So the College Board a number of years ago said, let's make this easier for families. Rather than having to send it to 5 different places, have them send it to 1, and we'll take care of getting the information sent to each of those individual colleges. Not every college participates in Idoc, but if a student is applying to places like Harvard, Princeton, Stanford, MIT, Boston College, they are participants in Idoc. Idoc generally follows the CSS profile list, and if they are selected, they can then send all the information to one place that then gets passed rather than having to go through and send it to those individual colleges. So it's just a way to make that process easier for students. Now, if the student also applies to a college that isn't in the Idoc system, they still need to send paperwork there. So don't forget that as well.
Great. A follow-up question on the undocumented students question we had earlier. Martha wants to know, how can an undocumented student submit an EFC score if they can't fill out the FAFSA to be eligible for some of the aid?
Great question. So that becomes difficult. However, there are a couple of ways around that. One is that especially DACA students can file the FAFSA. There are instructions on how to do that. They won't qualify for federal aid, but if it's necessary to calculate an EFC, they can certainly do that through the system. In addition, there are a number of calculators that are out there on the internet, mostly through colleges, that will allow you to estimate your family contribution. So one opportunity might be to have the student go ahead and complete one of those. I would ask the funder if that would be acceptable, but to fill out one of those calculators and provide the result as a substitution for what might be possible otherwise.
Great workaround. I know some of our school counselors are not only working, actually let me advance this so people have your contact information, not only working with students, but working with their parents who may also want to return to college. We talked a little bit about, kind of where adult learners should go. Obviously start with the FAFSA, but anything else you would recommend in terms of encouraging their parents who want to continue their education?
Yeah, thank you. So there are a couple of pieces that are specifically germane to adult learners that I'd love to talk about. One of them specifically is often adult learners, not always, and I don't want to generalize or stereotype, but often adult learners will come back in having had a failed attempt in college originally. And that is a sort of a burden that they carry with them as they move into the system. just to talk for a minute about how that is experienced by adult learners coming back and how to work around that, I think is important. One piece that there is no good solution for, and I'll admit that, is if you owe money to a previous institution. So in some cases, a student may have just been listen, we were all at one point a dumb 18-year-old. I was a dumb 18-year-old. Maybe, I went to college and didn't do so well and walked out the door, and I wind up owing a significant amount of money to the institution. And there's a collection effort underway to collect that from me. It becomes very difficult to move forward if you cannot resolve that situation. So, the best advice is to start by trying to come to some resolution with the college in question. Maybe that's a payment plan. Maybe that is some way over time to make them whole. Maybe it's, searching for some other way to pay that off. But that becomes really important because otherwise that college is going to hold up your transcript, is going to hold up other information that becomes important. The next question is, if you haven't succeeded academically, it's important to understand the academic requirements for receipt of federal financial aid and other financial aid, and to be prepared to appeal if necessary. Lots of students don't know they can appeal, but to appeal if necessary, to say, I recognize that I didn't do such a great job as a 21-year-old, but I'm now in my 30s and I have a very different mindset and different focus on my education. So understanding the term, the actual financial aid term, is the Satisfactory Academic Progress Standards, or SAP standards, at your college are really important. And understanding how to appeal if they're considering prior work is also really important. So you're prepared in that regard. The third thing I would say for, again, adult learners coming back is, especially for our adult learners who are leaving a job or have left a job, maybe not of their own volition, and are now looking to go back to college, we're in sort of a catch-22 situation where the income that's being measured is the income from a period of time where they were working full-time, but now maybe they're reducing their hours or they've been let go and they're going back to school, and we're still looking back at that income from a period where they were working full-time. And that really isn't fair, but that's the way the system is built. That's why you want to look at that professional judgment request. I know we'll talk more about in part 3, but just to give you a hint of that coming attraction, really important that adult learners understand that if they're going to have a significant income reduction, they want to explore the professional judgment option, because their income will be based on the prior year, and they don't want to wait 2 years to catch up.
Great. So teeing up part 3, I was going to bring that up while you're talking, since we will have you back. So for those of you who are working with students and families whose financial situation has changed due to COVID, and there are many, that's where we'll get into the specific circumstances, or special circumstances, sorry, around professional judgment that the financial aid folks can do to recognize that their situation has changed. We will also be talking about the latest financial updates coming out of the COVID Relief Act and the Omnibus bill. I think I'm saying that right, sorry. Both of those are coming up on February 24th from 11 to 12. We will have Daniel back for that one. We'll also have our partners from NCAN. Part 4 of the series, NCAN will come back, update their FAFSA verification research that they did a couple years ago. They did a new piece of this, so there's some interesting findings there. How to help reduce melt, like a lot of us have heard of summer melt. There's also verification melt. Students who get flagged for verification don't complete the verification process and then never start college in the fall. So we're going to talk about that on March 11th from 1 to 2. In addition to that, we also are thrilled to bring onto the webinar space a conversation with Florida leaders about the value of higher education. We're going to have Mark Wilson, who's with the head of the Florida Chamber. We're going to have Dr. Mark Rosenberg, who's president of FIU, and Alexis Robertson from USF joining us for that conversation. If you're not already a subscriber of FCAN, I encourage you to do so. That way you won't miss any of the upcoming webinars, policy briefs, or promising practices that we are always coming out with. Many, many thanks to Brawlio Cologne, and Daniel Barkowitz for joining us today, helping us to understand how to guide students in one of the most critical steps they need to complete their credential. Thank you so much for joining us today, and stay safe out there. Bye now.